LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the March 14th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 14 best most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be an informative, interesting, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight, I hope. There's a link down in the video description to my list of my 14 clips. There's also a link down there today to the bonus Dash and Sandy clip people have been asking me about for weeks, if not months, where it's Dash eats a sardine, Sandy eats bacon. I have put a link for a Patreon-only patron clip just for this week. If you can go on Patreon, I think you can donate as little as $1 a month, and you can cancel it after the first month, I think. But if you want to see it right now, that's just to honor my Patreon patrons, who are my most reliable source of income, certainly more reliable than YouTube advertising. So I wanted to say that's down in the video description. And then I will be showing a teaser of that clip at the end of the show, and then I'll show the full clip at the end of next week's show. But my topics this week have nothing to do with Dash eating sardines and Sandy eating bacon. It's actually Biden's last win in Congress, ? Because he got his big victory with 50 votes, no Republicans in the Senate, and no Republicans in the House. I think one Democrat even voted against it. So it was almost a completely partisan, straight line, party line vote to get his $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan passed. And that's why my question is, what are they going to do to pass things through the Senate when they need 60 votes, not 50? And that's one of the topics I'll be covering. And also, there's sort of this second topic of Republican voter suppression and how it's kind of the new Jim Crow. If you're looking over my left shoulder here, it's the new Jim Crow, is that book, which is more about the criminal legal system. We don't really call it the criminal justice system anymore. And the final part of my topics, or it's really part of the Biden, the reason that the Republican voter suppression is part of the Biden's last win topic is because if Republicans in the 43, or they're like 43 states that have 250 bills to make it harder and harder for Democratic voters to vote, that means this could be Biden's last win, Democrats' last win for like 10 years till all the lines get redrawn. And they're trying to pass a voting rights bill, H.R. 1, which I talked about a little bit last week, and I'll have Stacey Abrams on talking about that. And I'll talk somewhat about the COVID crisis in general. I'll have a couple Anthony Fauci clips talking about how things could be getting better and how they might be getting worse. And now I want to get to my first clip, the political comedy clip. This actually isn't really comedy, but there is sort of a humorous line at the beginning. It's called the byline, BYE, at the end of Jonathan Capehart's new show on MSNBC, The Sunday Show. And he's following this sort of circuitous path. He doesn't mention Trey Gowdy, but Trey Gowdy, former Republican member of Congress, now has been hosting a show on Fox News where he decided to attack Joy Reid from MSNBC, who he shares a time slot with, for attacking Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate. Well, there are only 3 black Republicans, or 3 black senators in total. 2 are Democrats, 1 Republican. So Tim Scott is the black Republican senator, and Joy Reid said he added a patina of diversity to the Republican news conference that she watched, and then Trey Gowdy attacked Joy Reid. And Tim Scott came on Trey Gowdy's show, said that woke supremacy is as bad as white supremacy, which led Jonathan Capehart to give this 3 or 4 minute, I guess it would be an essay, very well written essay that he read at the end. You can even see at the end he's looking at the pages. So it's a really well written essay that he gave about white supremacy and why it is much worse than woke supremacy, whatever that even is, which is kind of a joke. Although he also uses a joke line near the beginning I won't give away till after the clip. And then there's something he left out that I also want to talk about, and I have clips for afterwards. But let's start off watching about 4 minutes of the end of the Sunday show with Jonathan Capehart that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and to remove all doubt, the famous saying goes. During an interview on Fox News last week, Senator Tim Scott proved it to be true to stunning effect. The South Carolina Republican didn't like how our very own Joy Reid said his presence at a recent press conference with conservative colleagues gave it, quote, the patina of diversity. Have a listen to how the only black Republican in the U.S. Senate responded after a customary tirade by a Fox News malcontent.
Woke supremacy is as bad as white supremacy. We need to take that seriously.
What in the sunken place? Woke supremacy ranks up there with that tired crutch of the right known as cancel culture. The purpose of both phrases is to shield folks from criticism when they're called out for their actions or their deeply ignorant musings that peddle in racism, xenophobia, or misogyny. It's also used to deny dignity to those of us who rise up and demand it in defiance of a dominant culture that depends on our silence. Or, in the case of Senator Scott, complicity in maintaining that silence. Woke supremacy is not real, but white supremacy is very real. Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative once told me that the racial inequity white supremacy fosters has created a kind of smog that we all breathe in, and it's prevented us from being healthy. Isabel Wilkerson writes in her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, that the caste system white supremacy constructs is unyielding in its durability because its very invisibility is what gives it power and longevity. The result is African Americans being viewed with suspicion and being held at the bottom of the social order, no matter our education or the state of our finances. What is not invisible is the impact of white supremacy and those who enforce it. The clearest example is the January 6th insurrection of the U.S. Capitol by white supremacists, egged on by a white supremacist president, intent on overturning the election he lost. But we have borne witness to myriad other manifestations of white supremacy. Last year, a white woman called the cops falsely, claiming a black man was threatening her in Central Park after he asked her to follow the rules and put her dog on a leash. Barbecue Becky called the cops in 2018 on two black men grilling in an Oakland, California park. Permit Patty called the cops that same year on an 8-year-old black girl selling bottled water outside her own home in San Francisco. Between 1916 and 1970, 6 million African Americans fled the racial terror lynchings of the South in the Great Migration north and west. And in Tim Scott's own state, an avowed and unrepentant white supremacist walked into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, to murder 9 black parishioners as they prayed. I defy Senator Scott to ask the families of those murdered in that 2015 slaughter if something as ridiculous as woke supremacy is as bad as white supremacy. I defy him to ask the families of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Jordan Davis, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Elijah McClain, Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery, Tatiana Jefferson, Daniel Prude, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, to name a few, if the pernicious power of white supremacy contributed to the loss of their loved ones. Tim Scott has nothing to say to them. Given his track record, this is one time a black man's silence is golden, lest he prove himself a fool again. I'm Jonathan Capehart, and this has been The Sunday Show.
So yeah, I thought that was pretty awesome. I especially the political comedy there, as I really enjoyed that 4-word phrase. What was it? What the sunken place? I like that reference as sort of my political comedy of the day, and I've been thinking maybe a lot of cable news hosts, they have their followers, or I guess even YouTube hosts, they have their followers. They're called something like All In with Chris Hayes. They're the Inners. I think they should be the Capehart Crusaders. What do you think? Capehart Crusaders. I think he was definitely the best choice to replace Joy Reid on AM Joy. I definitely like him better than Tiffany Cross, who does the Cross Connection on Saturdays. The one criticism I have, he did that whole thing on white supremacy and didn't really touch on this big issue that was covered on other Sunday shows, the voter suppression, which is, like I said, it's kind of a new iteration of Jim Crow era voting rights laws since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court. And I'm going to do things a little differently. I'm going to cover that topic first, especially because Meet the Press, they had this very brief news summary I'm going to show later, and then they mentioned they were going to do this voting rights coverage, and then Chuck Todd did a much longer summary of Republican voter suppression efforts. I do have one criticism of what Chuck Todd did, but I will wait till after I show that it's an introduction by Chuck Todd, and then he goes to the package. This is him having like the longest summary of this problem, and of course the biggest package to go with it. In the this is not from the beginning of Meet the Press. It's partway through the program, but it shows what was missing from Jonathan Capehart's byline, and I will talk about it with you a little more after. And it mentions the new Jim Crow a couple times, and I'll talk about it with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
We're going to take a special look this morning at the fight underway over our democracy. Republicans have proposed more than 250 laws in 45 states designed to limit mail-in, early in-person voting, and even election day voting. And Republicans may have the power to achieve these goals. They hold legislative majorities and the governorships, as you can see here, in 24 states. And they have proposed some restrictive election laws in 22 of them. The bills would likely have the effect of curtailing the early vote methods used primarily this past election by Democratic voters and shift more voting to Election Day, when recently Republican voters have dominated. All told, the bills amount to the greatest effort to reduce ballot access, particularly for African Americans, since the Jim Crow era. Among the states considering the changes, 5 that Joe Biden turned blue last year: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. All have Republican legislatures, by the way. And the 3 large states he lost by less than 5 points: Texas, North Carolina, and Florida, also Republican legislatures in theirs. Republicans insist they're just trying to eliminate voter fraud, inspired in part by former President Trump's false claims that somehow this last election was stolen. Democrats say it is all a cover for an effort to elect Republicans by limiting Democratic voters' access to the polls.
It smells like Jim Crow laws in the past. This smells like poll taxing. It smells like the voter suppression.
This bill is about reviewing a process that we saw flawed.
In Georgia this week, the state Senate approved a measure that would eliminate no-excuse absentee voting, among other changes, undoing a 2005 Republican-backed law. The Republican Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan boycotted the debate, watching it from his office.
It certainly didn't feel good to put a space between myself and my Senate colleagues, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. Sometimes, leadership is lonely.
The Georgia House passed a sweeping bill that includes provisions that would limit early voting hours on weekends and restrict the use of drop boxes for mail-in ballots.
People died, people were blooded, people marched and fought for the right to vote. And this just takes us backwards.
Republican legislators across the country are proposing the greatest reduction in voting access since the late 19th century. From Arizona,
if you want to get NyQuil, you got to show an ID.
This bill hurts people of color. This bill hurts people in my district.
To Iowa, where Governor Kim Reynolds signed legislation this week cutting the state's early voting period and closing the polls an hour earlier on Election Day.
It was just a natural extension of what has happened, where voters are asking for more, election security.
That big lie has been debunked. It has been debunked more than 100 times in courts of law. In Iowa, Republicans, heck, you won! You won big in 2020 here.
In fact, the highest profile recent example of election fraud was in 2018 in North Carolina Republican Mark Harris's 9th District campaign.
If there's a single Republican Party county meeting going on where they're still talking about election fraud or conspiracy theories, they're losing ground.
There's a false narrative that you either care about access to the ballot or you care about integrity of the election. That's a false choice.
In Florida, where the legislature is racing to add new voting restrictions, a new poll shows most Floridians, including a majority of Republicans, want them to make voting easier. 2/3 of voters support adding more early voting days to the calendar.
There's nothing that shortening the period by which people can vote early does to combat any perceived fraud. There's nothing that closing polls earlier on election day does to prevent fraud. It's really just cover for what they're really trying to do, which is to make it harder to vote.
In response, Democrats in the House have passed sweeping voting rights legislation. It stands little chance in the Senate under its current rules, where it would need 10 Republican votes. Republicans argue it's unconstitutional, saying it shifts the responsibility for regulating elections from the states to Congress.
Everything about this bill is rotten to the core. This is a bill as if written and held by the devil himself.
Georgia is ground zero for this battle over our democracy. And joining me now are Stacey Abrams, the founder of Fair Fight, a group that promotes voting rights, and the Republican lieutenant governor of Abrams' home state of Georgia. It's Jeff Duncan.
And my one criticism, you can see at the end there, they after that really great news summary of Republican voter suppression, mentioning the new Jim Crow, I think twice in there, and talking about in great detail the number of bills and the states that they're happening in and the chances of H.R. 1. And then who are the two guests that Chuck Todd has on to talk about voter suppression? He's got Stacey Abrams of Georgia, a voting rights advocate who opposes Republican voter suppression, and then Republican Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, who also opposes Republican voter suppression. So, I mean, it would be nice if he had someone on there who was going to try to justify what Republicans are doing, you know, the claims of fraud and all that stuff. By the way, I was reading the live comments along the way, and I saw, is that Marilyn or Marlin, saying, because there's no I there, say there is no voter fraud. And if you stay tuned for the clip after next, you'll see Jake Tapper actually fact checks Stacey Abrams' statement that there is no voter fraud by pointing out just a few instances, just not election-changing voter fraud. But first I want to show Chuck Todd's questioning of Stacey Abrams about the chances of the H.R. 1 and passing the Senate. And she talks about filibuster reform, which is something I've talked about for weeks, if not months also, which I'll talk about a little more after we watch Stacey Abrams talk about what she expects and conversations. She hasn't talked to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, you'll see in this clip. The one criticism I have of Chuck Todd is he doesn't get a new Jim Crow out of her. Jake Tapper gets a new Jim Crow out of Stacey Abrams in the next clip, but Chuck Todd gets no new Jim Crow from Stacey Abrams asking her about the prospects for voter protections that the H.R. 1, that's House Resolution 1, the very first bill passed by the House, which is headed to the Senate with very poor prospects, or the very first bill numbered by the House, I should say. And here's Stacey Abrams talking about that with Chuck Todd this morning. Over here.
And I want to start with the issue of H.R. 1. The House has passed this bill. The reality is it's not going to overcome the Senate filibuster. So I guess my question for you is, do you think it's the Democrats should pare down H.R. 1, focus it on all things voting rights and voter access? Or is it the focus should be on eliminating the filibuster?
I think the focus should be on protecting our democracy. We know that January 6th was the opening salvo in an attempt to roll us back to Jim Crow era. We are watching 7 times the number of bills permeating across state legislatures than occurred in 2020 during election year. And we know that the U.S. Senate, much like the U.S. House, has the sole responsibility under the Elections Clause of the U.S. Constitution to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections. That is something that we have to accomplish. It would be best if it was done in concert with Republicans, as we have in times past when we had to confront our demons and do better by our people. And my deep hope is that we can get it done. But I would say that an exemption to the filibuster for the purposes of protecting our democracy is not only logical, it is fundamental to who we are.
Have you personally talked with Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema about this specific angle of suspending the filibuster?
I have not, but I believe that these conversations are ongoing amongst the number of senators. Look, I understand wanting to protect the perquisites of an institution. I served as minority leader for 7 years, but I also understand that there were times where we had to look at the fundamentals of our processes and do what was right. And we know the Senate has done so to suspend the filibuster for the purposes of judicial appointments, for cabinet appointments, and for budget reconciliation. I would say protection of the fundamentals of our democracy, which we have seen bloodily debated through the January 6th insurrection, certainly counts. And when you look at the 253 bills moving through state legislatures, sadly 50 of them through Georgia itself, we know that now is the time for Congress to take up the role that it alone has, which is to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections.
I want to get you to respond to something Jennifer Rubin wrote in the Washington Post, specifically about H.R. 1. And she writes, the legislation's only hope, and it is a slim one, rests with Democrats' willingness to pare down the measure to match the nature of the current assault on voting rights. If Democrats remove issues that will be used as a pretext for opposition, they can make this a clear up or down issue on voter suppression. Are you for or against Jim Crow laws? And, you know, I will note you didn't directly answer my first question about H.R. 1 and about the decision, should it be pared down. There are some other provisions in there that, while noble and maybe good ideas, are not as directly about the issue of access to the ballot box by individual voters. What do you think of that solution? Do you think Democrats should be thinking about a pared down version of this bill?
I believe the Democrats should do their level best to pass laws that protect our democracy. And I'm not being evasive. What I'm telling you is that we have to pay attention to the whole of our democracy, and we have to defend and protect that democracy. That means doing the work necessary to ensure that every American who is eligible to vote can do so. I am not in the U.S. Senate. I have served in a legislative body where everything is up for grabs and everything is on the table. But I'm not going to presuppose anything other than the responsibility that Congress has, because we have an a priori issue. The a priori issue is that the Senate has to believe it has the responsibility and the ability to act, and that is why my focus is on making certain that the exemption to the filibuster be the necessary front and center conversation so we can get something done to protect our democracy.
So yeah, that last part is what I was talking about with you last week, and I mentioned James Clyburn had been on, I think was it on the Sunday show with Jonathan Capehart? I think it was. Talking about this carve-out from the filibuster, that how they said it doesn't apply to Supreme Court justices, federal court appointments, cabinet appointments, so they're going to, like, voting rights or protecting constitutional rights or something like that, create a carve-out to the filibuster so they can just pass it with 50 votes. And you saw Stacey Abrams stuck to that pretty closely in her answer to Chuck Todd. And at the beginning, he did get a new Jim Crow out of her. I was wrong about that. It's what he didn't get was what Jake Tapper got. Which, in this next clip, you'll see Jake Tapper asking more directly about racism. Chuck Schumer saying that the laws were racist, that these voter suppression laws are racist, and Stacey Abrams obviously agrees and doesn't just say the new Jim Crow, it's the new Jim Crow in a suit and tie. That's what Jake Tapper gets, and also fact checks the claim about no fraud in the elections in this clip.
Back to State of the Union, I'm Jake Tapper. Across the country, many Republican legislatures are reversing pandemic-era rules meant to make it easier for citizens to vote. While President Biden and congressional Democrats want to expand voting options, it's not clear they'll be able to even get a Senate vote on the floor because of the filibuster. And joining me now, Georgia Democrat and voting rights advocate Stacey Abrams. Leader Abrams, thanks for joining us. So Republican state lawmakers in your home state, Georgia, have introduced almost 24 bills to make it more difficult to vote. They are going to end no-excuse mail-in voting, which has been there since 2005. They're going to reduce voting on Sundays, ask for stricter ID requirements, take away drop boxes. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in D.C., he called this effort by Georgia Republicans, quote, racist, plain and simple, unquote. Do you agree? And is there any way for Democrats to stop these efforts?
Well, first of all, I do absolutely agree that it's racist. It is a redux of Jim Crow in a suit and tie. We know that the only thing that precipitated these changes, it's not that there was a question of security. In fact, the Secretary of State and the governor went to great pains to assure America that Georgia's elections were secure. And so the only connection that we can find is that more people of color voted, and it changed the outcome of elections in a direction that Republicans do not like. And so instead of celebrating better access and more participation, their response is to try to eliminate access to voting for primarily communities of color. And there's a direct correlation between the usage of drop boxes, the usage of in-person early voting, especially on Sundays, and the use of vote by mail, and a direct increase in the number of people of color voting.
And in fact, the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, a Republican, has said that he thinks it's Donald Trump insulting the process that led to so many Trump voters not turning out for the special elections, thus handing the U.S. Senate to the Democrats. We should point out, of course, it's not just in Georgia. Republicans in 43 states are pushing more than 250 pieces of legislation that would make it more difficult for individuals to vote. They say they're doing this for vote security. Arizona Republican State Representative John Kavanaugh told CNN, quote, there's a fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats value as many people as possible voting, and they're willing to risk fraud. Republicans are more concerned about fraud, so we don't mind putting security measures in that won't let everybody vote. But everybody shouldn't be voting, unquote. What's your reaction when you hear that from a Republican elected official?
Well, my reaction when I hear that from any American is that I'm fundamentally disappointed that they misunderstand our democracy. Our system of government demands active participation from citizens to direct the future of our nation. And we should be deeply disappointed in anyone, any American citizen, and certainly anyone who took the oath of office who seeks to restrict access to the right to vote and uses this false predicate of fraud, which we have seen disproven in multiple courts and by the Supreme Court, as well as by the governors and secretaries of state in almost every state. We know that voter fraud did not happen, but we know that voter participation did increase. And we should all be small d democratic in the sense that we should want as many people as possible who are eligible to have a voice in the direction of our nation. If we are willing to invest our dollars, we should be allowed to have a voice in our system. That was the fundamental premise of this nation. And that's why H.R. 1, S.R. 1, and H.R. 4 are such essential pieces of legislation. Because whether it's happening in Georgia, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, in Kansas, in Iowa, where voter suppression is rearing its head yet again, it is our responsibility to ensure that no matter where you live in the United States of America, the right to vote and the access to that vote is protected.
We shouldn't say there's no fraud. There's no significant fraud, but there obviously has been some fraud here and there. I know of at least 2 or 3 Trump voters in Pennsylvania who voted for their dead parents. So there has been some fraud, just not anything that would change the course of the election. Are you worried if these laws...
I could have used that for my political comedy clip too, I guess. Jake Tapper pointing out, well, you can't say no fraud because there were some Republican Trump voters in Pennsylvania who voted for their, voted in the names of their dead parents. Which is true. There are always little pockets of fraud, but the biggest voter fraud case in the last few years was Republican fraud in a congressional campaign. I think it was in North Carolina, if I'm remembering correctly. But anyway, I thought Stacey Abrams was awesome in that clip and the previous clip. She's an awesome activist. I think she has a great political future. I don't know, later in that interview, I think it was Jake Tapper asked about whether she was going to run for governor of Georgia, and she was, working on expanding voting rights, which and that was all she would answer, as many politicians do. But I think she definitely has a political future, and we'll be seeing more of Stacey Abrams, even though her, as she mentioned in the clip before last, her highest job was the minority leader in the Georgia legislature. So leader of the Democrats, which did not hold the majority, because Georgia used to be a red state, now a blue state, in large part thanks to Stacey Abrams. So at least in the last election, it was a blue state. Before I finish up my topic of white supremacy from Jonathan Capehart, and then Republican voter suppression that is definitely racially discriminatory, as you saw in that last clip, Stacey Abrams explaining why these laws are racist, at least in their effect. And then there's just some weird racism going on in large parts of the Republican Party. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. This actually, I think, got a little bit overblown on MSNBC, where because they said that he. When I first heard this reported on MSNBC, I heard it reported as Ron Johnson said he wasn't scared at the January 6th insurrection because the insurrectionists were white people. He would have been scared if they were black people, which that's not exactly what he said. It's kind of the subtext, I guess, of what he said. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is from Fox News Sunday. I'm sorry, this is from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where George Stephanopoulos plays a clip of Ron Johnson making his, arguably racist comment. And John Barrasso doesn't denounce it, but doesn't endorse it, as you might expect. John Barrasso from Wyoming. I think he has a bookshelf behind him, and the two books you can really see say Wyoming on them. So I guess to remind you, he's from Wyoming, the state in the Senate that has the same number of votes in the Senate as California, even though they have 500 to 600,000 people. California has 53 members in the House of Representatives, which is apportioned according to population. So California has 53, Wyoming has 1, but they're equal in the Senate. And John Barrasso, that's the subtext of the books behind him, in my mind, that I will talk about his answer a little more with you after we watch together over here.
On which we agree.
Your colleague Ron Johnson of Wisconsin has stirred up controversy with remarks about the Capitol riots and Black Lives Matter protests. I want to show them.
I knew those are people that love this country, that truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break a law. And so I wasn't concerned. Had the tables been turned and President Trump won the election, and those were tens of thousands of Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters, I might have been a little concerned.
I should point out that the overwhelming majority of BLM protests, more than 90%, were peaceful. Democrats are calling on Senator Johnson to resign. Do you agree with those comments? Should he apologize?
Well, you take a look. You talk about peaceful protests. Look what's happened in Portland just the other night. These things continue. We need to get back to a nation and a state where the razor wire can come down, the fences can come down, people can get back to Washington and the Capitol. We need to move the country forward, and that's, to me, the best way that we ought to go.
So should he apologize?
Well, he's going to speak for himself. You know this, George. You spent time on the Hill. Every member speaks for themselves, and I'm telling you what I believe.
Senator Barrasso, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Roundtable's up.
So, yeah, like I said, I pretty much pre-criticized that clip and did not denounce, did not endorse, but was definitely speaking for the least populous of the states, Wyoming, as I explained before I showed that clip. That is the last clip in this first topic of white supremacy, Republican voter suppression, and weird racist comment from Ron Johnson to round out the topic. Before I move on to the news summaries, normally I put the news summaries at the beginning, but as I explained it First, I had a political comedy clip that wasn't really comedy. I just kind of like that one humorous reference to the sunken place that was comedy. And then I covered the whole topic of the political comedy clip before any of the news summaries, except, of course, I showed the NBC News Meet the Press news summary of the racist Republican voter suppression laws. But now I'm going to get to the actual beginning of the program news summaries, including a very brief one at the end from, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's actually will be the second to last news summary, the longest one and the best one in terms of explaining what was in the American Rescue Plan, the COVID relief bill that Democrats just passed with no Republican support. The best news summary for that came from CBS News' Face the Nation. Margaret Brennan started off, handed off to Mark Strassman, who again is in Atlanta for inexplicable reasons, but I think does a good job. And one thing to use for comparison on other news summaries, remember this American Rescue Plan, the COVID relief bill that just passed, has support of like 75% of the American public in polls, including like 60% of Republicans. At least in this CBS News Face the Nation news summary, they mention that it has strong support, which we will contrast to the Fox News Sunday news summary that comes afterwards, after we watch the CBS News Face the Nation one together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. President Biden's American Rescue Plan has been signed into law, and it is one of the largest stimulus bills in American history. Its impact, particularly on low-income Americans, could be significant. Traditional political party lines could also be altered. Make no mistake, Democrats support and Republicans oppose the overall package, but some provisions in the new law are longtime priorities of conservatives. We begin this morning with senior national correspondent Mark Strassman.
For the first time in a long time, this bill puts working people in this nation first.
President Biden will spend this week selling his new deal for COVID America. After a year defined by loss, the American Rescue Plan becomes Washington's nearly $2 trillion lifeline. Potentially transformative, how it expands the social safety net. 2 pandemic unemployment programs will extend into September and add up to an extra $300 a week in benefits. Multi-billion-dollar hikes in housing aid, food stamps, and Obamacare subsidies. $50 billion for small business relief. And $350 billion in aid to state and local governments, radioactive to many conservatives as a bailout for Blue America. Despite broad public support, not one Republican in Congress voted for the package.
It was a multi-trillion-dollar Trojan horse full of bad old liberal ideas.
Financially, this stimulus bill will also be a booster shot to the middle class and the poor. A much more generous child tax credit, and for millions of people, $1,400 in direct payments that start going out this weekend. Under the new temporary child tax credit, income-eligible families will get up to $3,600 for each child under 6, and up to $3,000 for older children under 18. Partial benefits could roll out as soon as this July. Roughly 280 million Americans will qualify for Washington's third round of stimulus checks, including Lyft driver Marquise Rhodes in Atlanta. Business is better, but last year his family barely dodged eviction. His family qualifies for $4,200 in aid. That will buy peace of mind.
I'm not out of the woods, but it gives me a small cushion to say, okay, if something does happen, I at least have this to kind of fall back on.
For millions of Americans, it's also help finding hope, another casualty of this pandemic.
Mark Strassman reporting from Atlanta. Our new CBS News poll out this morning shows that Americans do have hope and optimism about the coming months. A record high 64% of those surveyed think efforts to contain the coronavirus are going well. The majority gives President Biden credit for how things are going, with over 2/3 saying he's doing a good job of handling both the outbreak and vaccine distribution. We go now to Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto for insight.
And I'm not going to show the Anthony Salvanto polling behind the polls stuff, but As I pointed out many times, there's a link down in the video description to the CBS News Face the Nation channel on YouTube, where the entire Face the Nation program pretty much is split into segments, including, you can see that Anthony Salvanto, you can see the polling from CBS. I just showed the beginning of it, and it seems like good news that people think that COVID is, they're optimistic about COVID, but I'm a little worried that people are letting down their guard too soon. I've seen some of that locally, and I'm going to show you an Anthony Fauci clip talking about that a little later. You saw how Mark Strassman, I think he's CBS's national correspondent or chief national correspondent, but he's still like stuck in Atlanta. And I don't know, is it just me or did it seem like he's stuck in Atlanta and had to interview his Lyft driver to have something to send in? No, that's actually, I think that was a really good interview about the impact of the American Rescue Plan, the COVID relief bill, and I thought the news summary there explained a lot of the benefits. Apparently it's going to create like 7 million jobs. It's going to make economic growth go up to like 6%. It was supposed to be like 4.2%. It's going to go up to 6%. They keep saying it's going to take half of the U.S. children in poverty out of poverty. And, you know, at first that sounds good, but then it makes me think like, yeah, what about the other half? What about the other half? But I don't know. That's just a question on my mind. But I want to show you the next news summary. And you, like I said, before I showed the CBS News, before I showed CBS News's Face the Nation news summary, they did talk about how the American Rescue Plan had broad support, but no Republican votes. Watch the Fox News summary where they never mention the broad support. They do talk about no Republican support. They talk about how Biden has to sell it, how it's really divisive. You would never know from this news summary that, and Chris Wallace, David Spunt, none of them mentioned that about 75% of Americans support this bill. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch that Fox News summary together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The processing of those $1,400 direct payments has begun, with the first deposits hitting bank accounts this weekend. That stimulus, part of President Biden's $1.9 trillion rescue package, aimed at getting the country back on its feet 1 year into the COVID pandemic. But Republicans call the plan a liberal, even socialist agenda. In a moment, we'll speak with senators from both sides, Republican Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and Democrat Chris Murphy of Connecticut. But first, let's bring in David Spunt with the president this weekend in Wilmington, Delaware. David.
Chris, after weeks of trying to sell the plan to Republican members of Congress, the president will begin some heavy lifting as he heads out on the road to try to sell it to a divided America.
Help is here, and we will not stop working for you.
From the White House to the American people, President Biden will make multiple trips this week to tout his plan that pumps billions into vaccine research, small business relief, and education. On Tuesday, he'll visit the swing state of Pennsylvania. On Friday, he'll join the vice president in Georgia, where 2 Democratic victories in the January runoffs helped seal the deal for COVID relief.
You had faith that Congress would pass this plan simply because it is the best thing for the American people. And you put in the work to make it happen.
But despite hopes for bipartisanship, not a single Republican voted for the package, insisting large portions have nothing to do with pandemic relief.
I think this is actually one of the worst pieces of legislation I've seen pass here in the time I've been in the Senate.
Those same Republicans united against the relief plan are standing by for the president's other priorities, most notably infrastructure and immigration reform.
We must address this crisis at the border that is spiraling out of control.
While Leader McCarthy is visiting the border tomorrow, there are no plans, at least publicly yet, for the president to do so, though the calls are growing for him to do so from both sides of the aisle. Chris?
David Spunt reporting from Delaware. David, thank you. And joining us now, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy.
I don't have a clip of Bill Cassidy, and sometimes I talk about how Chris Wallace will make up for what was missing in the news summary by the question he asked the guest. Chris Wallace never brought up the fact that 75% of Americans supported the COVID relief bill. I will show a clip of Chris Wallace cross-examining Chris Murphy, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, where Chris Murphy brings it up, and that's the first and only time I think it was mentioned on Fox News Sunday. But I think I pretty much pre-criticized that clip. I think it was a lot closer to the Republican talking points than any of the other news summaries. The next one is Jake Tapper doing a fairly quick news summary. The State of the Union this week, I guess, is springing forward because of daylight savings. I don't know why we do this to ourselves every year. A lot of people have been grumbling about it. I'm hoping, if you're not an American viewer, we move from, here in California, we move from Greenwich Mean Time -8 to Greenwich Mean Time -7 for no apparent reason this morning at like 2 in the morning. And anyway, that's the State of the Union this week. And then Jake Tapper does a pretty good news summary of more stuff than, well, I'll talk about it a little more after we watch together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is springing forward. 1 year ago this weekend, reported deaths from COVID-19 were still just in the double digits, just under 70 confirmed deaths, as we all started to scramble to adjust to a sudden new normal, life in a pandemic. 1 year ago tomorrow, March 16th, 2020, President Trump announced 15 days to slow the spread. It would have been difficult at the time to imagine we would still be living under restrictions 1 year later. Today, there are more than 534,000 Americans dead from this virus, but in some ways, this moment does feel a bit optimistic. 1 in 5 Americans has received at least one dose of the vaccine, according to the CDC. Nearly 3 million people yesterday alone. In his first primetime address as president, Joe Biden outlined an aggressive timeline for the vaccine, saying the U.S. will have enough doses for every adult by the end of May, and pointing to the 4th of July as the beginning of America's independence from the virus. As states move to relax rapidly restrictions and air travel reaches its highest level since March 2020, however, health experts are continuing to warn that now is not the time to return to normal. Here to explain why and what's next, the president's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci.
And I'll have a couple Anthony Fauci clips, including one from Jake Tapper. Not talking about that. I have Anthony Fauci talking to Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday about why it is too soon to start relaxing things. That's what I was talking about earlier in terms of optimism. The CBS News Face the Nation news summary that ended with those polling numbers about people being optimistic about the end of COVID, which may mean that people are going to relax too soon, and there could be really bad consequences of that, which that's what I'm going to have Chris Wallace talking to Anthony Fauci about in clip number 11. But first I have to give you two more. And like I said, I thought that was a good, very brief news summary. All of these last 3 news summaries are about a minute long. I don't know what's with Jake Tapper's new glasses, but here is Chuck Todd in under a minute, briefly talking about the voting rights thing he's going to do and how he's going to get both sides from 2 people who both oppose Republican voter suppression laws, which makes no sense. But then talking a little bit about Joe Biden's bill, the American Rescue Plan in this brief news summary. I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Good Sunday morning. In a few minutes, we're going to take an in-depth look at Republican attempts across the country to pass a slew of new restrictive voting laws. We're going to lay out the scope of this effort, why Democrats insist these new laws are aimed at hurting their voters. We're going to talk to people on both sides of this issue. But we're going to begin with the COVID crisis. President Biden signed the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill on Thursday, then gave his first nationally televised speech as president, targeting July 4th for when Americans can gather in small groups.
That will make this Independence Day something truly special, where we not only mark our independence as a nation, where we begin to mark our independence from this virus.
And joining me now is the most trusted figure in the country on this subject. It's Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's the director.
And I don't have a Meet the Press Anthony Fauci clip, but he did go on several shows. But like I said, you saw he specifically showed like Stacey Abrams and Jeff Duncan as like both sides, even though both of them oppose Republican voter suppression laws in Georgia. So that was kind of bogus. And I mentioned that earlier, and there it was, pretty even more clearly than I remembered. But I want to go to this last news summary. George Stephanopoulos, ABC's This Week. Very similar content to what you just saw, of course, because it's covering the same topics. Then a brief view of Nancy Pelosi, who I don't have a clip from, but I will talk about briefly after we watch this ABC news summary from this morning together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week, a week that marks a major turning point in the fight against COVID. 1 year into the pandemic, President Biden delivered his first address to the nation, signed one of the most sweeping anti-poverty programs since the New Deal. Almost 90% of American households are eligible for stimulus checks. The first hit bank accounts this weekend. More than 93% of American children will draw income to their families, likely to lift nearly 6 million out of poverty. Overnight, the CDC reported 2.98 million vaccines administered in one day, a new record. More than 105 million doses have now been administered, on track to have the overwhelming majority of Americans vaccinated by this summer. As the president is set to hit the road this week to sell his plan, big questions now about what's next for his agenda. That's our focus this morning. We begin with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Madam Speaker, welcome to This Week.
Good morning.
And I actually thought Nancy Pelosi did a really good job of explaining the benefits of the bill. And actually, that ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary was probably second. Well, the Fox News news summary did talk about some of the benefits of the bill. The Face the Nation one, I think, gave the most detailed rundown. But for a less than 1 minute news summary from ABC there, they did a pretty good job of talking about some of the benefits. So anyway, those are all the news summaries. The last 4 clips I have for you now are I have one on the bill itself, the COVID relief bill. This is the one I talked about earlier. Chris Wallace talking to Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. Then I have 2 Anthony Fauci clips, and then finally Margaret Brennan doing probably the cross-examination of the week against New York Mayor Bill de Blasio about how he should have moved a week or 2 sooner and saved a lot of lives. Although, that's 20/20 hindsight, I guess, but that's when you cross-examine someone, you get to cross-examine them from 20/20 hindsight. So those are the last 4 clips I'm going to show. Before I get to that, I did want to, I see I've gotten 4 Super Chat contributors so far. Matthew, who I guess because I'm doing the show later this week, got to catch the show live and give a Super Chat contribution. Sinful Solutions, I appreciate your Super Chat contribution. Lulu Girl with the sardine for Dash and bacon for Sandy, smiley face. Yeah, I think you might have come in late, Lulu Girl, but I am going to show a teaser of the Dash and Sandy sardine and bacon clip at the end of the show, and there's a link down in the video description for patrons on Patreon. I think, Lulu Girl, you may be a Patreon patron. I seem to remember that. And so next week I will show the full Dash eats sardine, Sandy eats bacon clip at the end for free at the end of the show. But anyway, and then Andy M also gave a Super Chat contribution. So before I get to these final 4 news clips, I wanted to thank those Super Chat contributors who also are more supportive of my videos than YouTube advertising revenue. Also, just like the Patreon patrons, the direct PayPal contributors, there's a link down in the video description for that too. Those who press that join button down below the video, all ways to support my videos financially. And I like the people who give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and give the supportive comments as live viewers and recorded show viewers. It's always good for me to remember to thank my viewers for all the ways they support me. And I hope you appreciate the time I've spent this Sunday and every Sunday for the last 412 Sundays watching these shows, picking out the clips, adding my commentary and criticism. And with that, I will get to the last 4 news clips, starting with the one I promised earlier, where Chris Wallace cross-examines Chris Murphy, the Connecticut senator, Democrat, who does a great job defending the American Relief Act against charges that it's not about COVID, against charges that it's going to cause inflation, I think is in this clip. And like I said, this is the one place where someone finally mentions that 70% of the American public supports the bill, which didn't come up in the news summary earlier, as I mentioned when I showed it. And I'll talk about this clip a little more after we watch it together over here.
At least in the short term, Democrats' legislative victory this week is likely to be politically popular. But what if the economy overheats and some of the massive new spending doesn't...
Oh, and I forgot to say, and of course, to add insult to injury, when Chris Wallace starts off that clip, he doesn't mention how politically popular it is now, but it could be politically popular in the short term because, you know, you're giving out free money. So he doesn't even mention how popular it is, but says it could be. And so that makes the bias that I showed earlier even worse, and Chris Murphy corrects him on that again in this clip.
At least in the short term, Democrats' legislative victory this week is likely to be politically popular. But what if the economy overheats and some of the massive new spending doesn't stand up to scrutiny? Joining us now, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator, I just heard, as I'm sure you heard, discussing some of the positives of the plan with Senator Cassidy. I want to talk to you about some of the concerns that he raised. Here is Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell this week on the $1.9 trillion plan.
This wasn't a bill to finish off the pandemic. It was a multi-trillion-dollar Trojan horse full of bad old liberal ideas. President Biden's own staff keep calling this legislation, quote, the most progressive bill in American history.
The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says $700 billion, that's more than a third of all the funding, won't be spent till next year or later. So, Senator Murphy, how does that qualify as COVID relief?
Well, as you mentioned, this bill is wildly popular amongst the American public. 75% of Americans support it because they know that this is the moment to go big. 80% of people out there don't have enough money to pay their monthly bills. And so that's why you need to put an unprecedented amount of money into the hands of low and middle income Americans. And I love this argument from Republicans that, you know, this is some progressive wish list. Almost everything in this bill is simply an extension of the programs that Republicans were wildly enthusiastic about back when they were in charge of the White House and the Senate. In fact, they were cheering some of these programs at the end of last year, like the $1,400 stimulus payments. Your question is specific. You know, what about the portion of the spending that is made eligible past 2021? Well, let me tell you, the crisis in America's schools is going to last beyond this year. The amount of catch-up that kids are going to have to do, the amount of work we're going to have to do to deal with the trauma that has been inflicted on kids who have been out of school for so long is significant. And so, yes, some of this money is going to be able to be spent in the next school year as well, because we know we have a Herculean endeavor ahead of us to try to make sure that kids and families are made whole. But the bill is popular because it's putting money right now into the hands of families who desperately need it.
Then there is the concern, which I discussed with Senator Cassidy, that it's just plain too much money. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says the economy is down about $600 to $700 billion because of the pandemic, not $1.9 trillion. And here's former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, a Democrat, on this subject.
There's a real possibility that within the year, we're going to be dealing with the most serious incipient inflation problem that we have faced in the last 40 years.
So, are Larry Summers and the CBO wrong?
Well, they are. We're not going to face an inflation problem. We're going to be sitting on an economy that is going to grow twice as fast as it would have without this bill. That is also what economists have told us. Listen, Republicans didn't think this exact amount of money was too big last March when they supported the CARES Act. And by the way, last March, there was 1/3 the number of people dying every day of COVID-19 as are dying today. And as you mentioned to Senator Cassidy, Republicans certainly didn't think that $1.9 trillion was too much when they were passing tax cuts for their wealthy friends. Listen, last week, as we were passing the American Rescue Plan, Republicans proposed to eliminate the estate tax for the tiny fraction of millionaires and billionaires that still pay it. They had no plans to pay for that. Once again, when it comes to supporting the richest, wealthiest Americans, Republicans are very enthusiastic about debt-financed tax cuts. But when it comes to supporting poor people or folks in the middle class, all of a sudden it's too hot for their taste.
Senator.
And kudos there to Chris Murphy for saying things you don't hear a lot on Fox News, where they pretend, Trump was the president of the working man, even though his big accomplishment was a tax cut that mostly went, in, as Chris Murphy was saying, to big corporations and rich people. That Larry Summers clip, is Larry Summers, I guess he is technically a Democrat, barely a Democrat, I don't know. Larry Summers didn't really look good there. The one thing Chris Murphy said, I kept talking about the Fox News bias, how they hadn't mentioned how popular the bill was. And then Chris Murphy, when he finally did say 75% of Americans support the bill, he said, as you were saying, it's popular, but that wasn't really what Chris Wallace said. He said that it might be popular in the short term. But anyway, this next clip I want to show is just to be fair and balanced, I guess. I want to show Chris Wallace doing a good job journalistically, despite the bias I talked about earlier, showing something that I don't think, well, he partially does a good job journalistically, showing facts that don't get played on Fox News enough, not just coming from Chris Murphy, a Democrat, as a guest, but you'll see it starts off here with Chris Wallace really drawing out Anthony Fauci on why it's bad to open up too early, and then Anthony Fauci explains it, and Chris Wallace says, so it's dangerous what Texas is doing, and Fauci says yes, and then Chris Wallace says because, and I don't yell at the TV a lot, but right at that point I said, because of what he just said, but then Fauci says it again, and actually says it better, so I guess maybe it was just an interviewing technique, but I think I pretty much pre-criticized this Fox News Sunday clip, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Might even do better.
I want to show our viewers two charts. Let me put them on the screen. First, the 7-day average of new cases, which spiked dramatically in January, is down sharply, but still over 50,000 per day. And second, the number of deaths reported per day, which also is down sharply, but if you look at that horizontal line, is still higher than it was during the very concerning spike last July. So I guess really two questions. Is it too soon to say that we are in the process of beating this virus? And what are the chances that this could still turn around and we could end up with a fourth wave of COVID?
That's the critical question, Chris. And when you see a plateau, we're very pleased by the sharp decline that you've shown. But when you see a plateauing at a level of anywhere between 50 and 65,000 cases a day, that is absolutely no time to declare victory, because we know from previous surges that we've had over the year that when you see that leveling off at a high level, there's always the risk of a surge back up. And in fact, unfortunately, that's exactly what is happening in Europe right now. They had the same kind of decline. They always seem to be a few weeks ahead of us in the dynamics of the outbreak. Then they plateaued because they pulled back a bit. They thought that they were home free, and they weren't. And now they're seeing an increase up. We have to avoid that, Chris. We're going in the right direction. Vaccines, as you mentioned, every day we get more and more people vaccinated, which gets us closer and closer to a better protection. To pull back now prematurely would be ill-advised.
Well, let's follow up on that issue. I'm going to ask you a question straight out. I want a straight answer. Given the tenuous situation we're in, is what Texas did this past week, ending the mask mandate, reopening 100%, is what Texas did dangerous?
I think it's risky and potentially dangerous, yes.
And you say that because?
Well, for the simple reason of what I just explained. If you have a baseline of infection that is quite high, and if you look at the numbers, we are not out of the woods yet. When you pull back on all mitigation methods, on all public health guidelines, that's when you get into trouble. I mean, history has proven that, Chris. This isn't just some kind of a theoretical a point that I'm trying to make. It's not theoretical. It actually happens. Take a look at January, February, March, April, in the late winter, early spring of 2020. Take a look at the summer of 2020. And now look at where we are right now. If you look at those numbers, that plateau bothers me and other public health officials. When you plateau at a high level, there's enough viral activity in the community that when you pull back on things like masking and not pay attention to avoiding congregate settings, it is very risky to get another surge. If you wait just a bit longer to give the vaccine program a chance to increase the protection in the community, then it makes pulling back much less risky. But if you do it prematurely, there really is a danger of triggering another surge.
President.
So I pretty much pre-criticized that clip, saying that I thought it was good information for Chris Wallace to bring out, but also, did he not hear the first part of Anthony Fauci's answer where he had to specifically ask why it was bad for Texas to relax restrictions too quickly? I mean, there was a lot of other talk about how we may be behind Europe. Europe is like Italy is is having to have a lockdown now. There is a New York strain that apparently might be more resistant to the vaccines. I think it's was it 1546 sort of? They all have numbers, but it's similar to the South African strain in that its mutation makes it less susceptible to the immunity you get from the vaccines. This next clip is actually about vaccines. One thing I wanted to mention, well, I was reading the live comments along the way, and I did get one more big super chat contribution from Chairsbed asking about the American Rescue Plan, the COVID relief bill, and something that I had thought of talking about, the big child tax credits, the thousands of dollars per child thing that is giving people, some people are getting $3,000, $5,000, up to $6,000 put into their bank accounts in the next few weeks. Well, that credit expires in a year, and I think actually it might be kind of a political time bomb. I think Chairsbed might be suggesting that in the question here, so what do you think about the relief plan and the social safety net aspects that will expire before the midterms? For them to be renewed, they will have to be voted on, and Republicans will have to defend their vote. Will their rebuff dissuade potential Republican voters? Or I'm not sure if you mean Republican congressional voters, but I do think it's a little time bomb where they're going to have to vote in an election year for, it's 90% of Americans are getting thousands of dollars in this social safety net that helps children, or that's where the largest portions come from, to parents, and there are a lot of Republican parents out there who are going to be getting these thousands of dollars. And are their representatives going to, in an election year, vote not to extend this? I think that is kind of something that they set up specifically so that Republicans will have to vote on it again in an election year, and not as part of a $1.9 trillion package, but as something renewing just certain aspects of the bill that really help their constituents. And are they going to say no? It's a good question, Chair's Bed, so thank you for that contribution and that question. I do want to get to the second Anthony Fauci clip, which is about what people who are vaccinated can do, and then about whether you have to stay 6 feet or 3 feet, and can schools open with 3 feet. This is Jake Tapper asking those questions, and I did want to mention that I'm going to have my own vaccination experience, hopefully, starting tomorrow. Tomorrow I have an appointment to get my first dose of either the Pfizer or Moderna. It could be either, according my healthcare provider sent me an email and said I was eligible. I don't know, it's because they lowered the eligibility to what particular condition it might be, but or why I am all of a sudden eligible yesterday to make the appointment tomorrow. But I'm not going to say no, so I will get my first dose tomorrow, and then my second dose in a few weeks, and then, well, 3 or 4 weeks depending on which one it is, and then a couple weeks after that I will be fully vaccinated, and maybe I can go get a haircut. I saw people were talking about my hair again, so that's right, 6 weeks till my next haircut. I said 8 months. I think it's been 8 months since a haircut last week, but no, it's over 9 months. June 1st is more than 9 months since this hair has been cut, so I am listening very carefully to what Anthony Fauci says about what people who are vaccinated might be able to do soon, and then also about this 3 feet, 6 feet thing. And if you're doing a drinking game, and for the Star Trek Next Generation fans out there, I dare you to drink every time Anthony Fauci says data in this clip.
The CDC finally released some guidelines for people who have been fully vaccinated. But those people are still not allowed to have medium-sized gatherings. They're still not allowed to travel, according to the CDC. Why? What do you, as a health expert, need to see to say it's okay for vaccinated individuals to travel or to be in a crowd? I mean, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people.
Well, Jake, let me tell you how it goes with regard to the CDC. The CDC is a science-based organization, so they really would like to get the data that would allow them to go to the next step. If they don't have the data, they'll do modeling. If they don't have the modeling, they will use, as you say, common sense expert opinion. So what we've seen was the first installment of what you can do if you're vaccinated. And that's what you just mentioned, what you can do in the home setting with a vaccinated people together, or vaccinated people with an unvaccinated person. You're going to see very soon similar types of guidelines for the American public with regard to travel, the workplace, all kinds of different things that you're asking right now. You will imminently be seeing those types of guidelines coming out. They just want to make sure that they get it right. Now, some people think that's a little bit too slow, but they're going to get there, and they'll get there soon.
So in terms of CDC guidance, as you know, the guidance for social distancing, for how far people should be, there's a discrepancy. Some places, some health organizations say 3 feet or a meter is enough. But here in the United States, we say 6 feet. There's this new study from researchers in Massachusetts, just out this week. It found no significant difference in coronavirus spreading in schools where there was 6 feet of distancing versus 3 feet of distancing. But that 6 foot requirement, that's one of the main hurdles to reopening schools.
Right.
Does this study suggest to you that 3 feet is good enough?
It does indeed, and that's exactly the point I'm making, Chuck. What the CDC wants to do is they want to accumulate data, and when the data shows that there is an ability to be 3 feet, they will act accordingly. They have clearly noted those data. They are, in fact, doing studies themselves. And when the data are just analyzed, and it's going to be soon. I mean, Jake, you're asking the right questions. And the CDC is very well aware that data are accumulating, making it look more like 3 feet are okay under certain circumstances. They're analyzing that, and I can assure you within a reasonable period of time, quite reasonable, they will be giving guidelines according to the data that they have.
So any mayors,
it won't be very long, I promise you.
Any mayors or governors or school district heads listening right now, if they hear you right now and they say, well, it sounds like Dr. Fauci thinks 3 feet is good enough, that will enable us to open our school. That's right?
Well, Jake, I don't want to get ahead of official guidelines. I can tell you and promise you, I talk to the CDC, to Dr. Walensky every single day. She is acutely aware of the accumulation of data and the fact that her team will be acting on the data the way they always do. Just stay tuned. It's going to come, and it's going to come soon.
Well, we are staying tuned for a lot of us who want schools to open safely, of course.
Right.
Dr. Fauci, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
So, good questions by Jake Tapper, good answers from Anthony Fauci. He kind of explained how science works, why, the novel coronavirus is a new thing, so they're accumulating data. And I don't know, I stopped watching. I had to go back and start producing here, but I saw Lulu Girl was counting the number of times he said data. And one thing I'm impressed with, I'm always impressed when people use prepositions that show they know the word data is plural. You heard, I think Anthony Fauci said those data, because it's like a datum, those data. It's like a forum is, well, I don't want to go into Greek plurals and everything, but most people, you think data is, you use it as a singular, but no, it's plural. Thank you, Anthony Fauci, for explaining how science works and the accumulation of data about new phenomena, talking about my plurals. But anyway, I want to get to the final news clip before the bonus teaser Dash and Sandy sardine and bacon clip. This is what I promised earlier was the best cross-examination, and it's Margaret Brennan cross-examining a Democrat I've never been a big fan of, Mayor Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York. Looks like Anthony Yang might be the next mayor of New York. That would be kind of cool. I was not a big fan of Bill de Blasio when he ran for president. When I covered that as part of the Democratic primary news coverage. But here I think Margaret Brennan does a really good job of pointing out, with 2020 hindsight, how he could have saved a lot of lives, just like Donald Trump could have saved a lot of lives. Well, Donald Trump, he was briefed early on about how bad things were going to be, and he admitted to on tape that he downplayed it. So you'll see Bill de Blasio tries to blame Cuomo, tries to blame I'll talk about the clip a little more after we watch it. It's only about 2 minutes. Final news clip together that we can watch together over here.
I want to ask you what you do have control of within your city. You detected the first COVID-19 case March 1st of last year. You waited until the 15th to shut down bars and restaurants, gyms and schools. And in fact, you tweeted yourself on March 15th telling people to go out and get that one last drink at the bar. Why do you think you were so late in understanding the threat?
Margaret, I'll tell you something. This is the anniversary of our first death, March 14th. We're doing a memorial tonight to remember everyone we lost and to keep their memories close in this city. But I'll tell you something. I was one of the first in America to shut schools, one of the first in America to shut bars and restaurants, and I called for shelter in place. One of the first, and unfortunately, my state government wouldn't agree to it. In fact, Governor Cuomo said shelter in place would be imprisoning New Yorkers.
That is true. You had that dispute very publicly with the governor. But on the other coast, San Francisco's mayor back on February the 25th declared an emergency in her city before there was a single infection. We were looking at Italy. Plenty of people sick there. The writing was on the wall, at least for her. Why didn't you see it?
Margaret, as I said, we closed schools on the 15th. We closed bars and restaurants, tried to move shelter in place. But I'll tell you something. We were trying to make sure that we were working on the best health evidence while also protecting our children who needed to be in school. And this is something I've really focused on as things have gotten better, keeping our schools open and bringing our schools back strong in September. This is the kind of thing we can now do with the stimulus money, thank God.
But do you feel
actually
responsible
take care
for
of
that?
our
Because
kids
the
and
former
families.
CDC director, Tom Frieden, has said that if you'd acted a week earlier, you could have saved 50 to 80% people.
That's just not accurate. The fact is, the thing that would have been great, the thing that would have been powerful is shelter in place.
Yeah.
When I called for it, Governor Cuomo wouldn't do it. Again, he said it would be, quote unquote, imprisoning New Yorkers. I mean, that's just outrageous. We had an opportunity. That was the missed opportunity. If I had had local control, we would have done shelter in place.
So I don't know. Like I said, I don't buy that. I thought it was a great cross-examination by Margaret Brennan, and it shows we can keep people like the Democratic mayor of New York accountable, even if it does involve some 20/20 hindsight. Certainly, a lot of the shows talked about keeping the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, accountable. He seems to be like under siege, possibly eventually will have to resign before being impeached and removed. That would show that Democrats hold their own accountable, unlike Republicans. Or, well, I guess there were 7 Republicans who voted to convict Trump in his second impeachment trial in the Senate, but looks like the legislature in New York might actually go all the way, or maybe get so close that Cuomo does actually resign. And I don't think he has much of a political future at this point, even if somehow he manages to stay in power. But anyway, I appreciate all of you who showed up for all of these news clips. I saw there was at least 1 or 2 trolls in there. I don't know why I get all these trolls for the live show, occasionally in the recorded show, but whatever. It's just words. It's just words. I don't know why people have such misguided opinions, but I'm just trying to give you the facts here, along with the newsmakers and the corporate news media anchors, and I'm trying to show where I agree with what the corporate news media is showing you, and also criticizing some of their questioning and their methods, and where I disagree. I think I've done both those things. I'm going to finish the show now. It's actually getting kind of late, and I'm kind of tired from this and other things I've been working on. So I did promise, though, before I finish the show, to give a teaser for the Dash Eats Sardine, Sandy Eats Bacon clip, that if you are a Patreon patron, or become one now at the link down in the video description to the full video of Dash Eats Sardine and Sandy Eats Bacon. That's for Patreon patrons this week. I think you can, for as little as $1, you can become a patron. Though at the $5 level, well, I used to say at the $10 level you get the Constitution and the sticker, Constitution sticker. But I actually send these out at the $5 level. At least in the United States, I send them both out. Because I do. But anyway, so if you want to become a patron on Patreon and see the full clip now, you can do that. Otherwise, here is the almost 20-second teaser, the very beginning, that doesn't actually show any of the eating over here. So that's the teaser of the Dash Eats Sardine, Sandy Eats Bacon clip that is available for patrons this week, and I will play in full. It's almost 4 minutes long. I'll play the whole thing at the end of next week's show, assuming everything goes according to plan next week. And until then, I'm busy doing a bunch of other stuff this week that I find it... I have really been hoping to make a filibuster reform video, especially because people are now actually even using the phrase filibuster reform, and I don't want to go into my whole idea now. I'm too tired, but hopefully sometime in the next couple weeks I'll have a chance to do that. But I will be back next Sunday and every Sunday, at least through May, doing these live clip roundups, and after that, who knows what. And like I've said multiple times already, I appreciate all of you who show up for the live and recorded shows. Give me your supportive comments, thumbs up, and all the other ways that you can support my channel. And until next week, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.